Good afternoon. Welcome to this afternoon's webinar by Rusli, and we are here this afternoon to discuss the future of economic crime in terms of policing. I'd like to thank you all for joining us. We're taking an hour out of your busy schedule, and I would like to move on very quickly to introduce the panel and who also have taken time out of their schedule. I think it's important to say this is an enormously important issue for all of us. And that's why we've drawn on quite a wide range of participants on the panel today. We have asked along to join us this afternoon, Richard Hyde, who is a senior researcher in the Social Market Foundation. We also have Dr. Sue Hawley, who is the executive director on Spotlight on Corruption. We have Ian Dyson, who was previously the Commissioner and National Lead for Fraud at the City of London and nationally. And finally, we have Mick Creedon, who was the Chief Constable of Derbyshire Police and also the National Lead for SOC. I'm going to ask each of the panelists to explain. They all have a particular interest in this area and a particular area of expertise. And I will let them describe and explain that at each point along the way. We will also have an opportunity for questions towards the end of the panel and the webinar. But I think, first of all, I'm going to spend just a few minutes popping all of this into context and why it's important that we start to consider the future. I think when we, first of all, look at the figures, it's estimated that economic crime costs the UK economy £137 billion a year. In real terms, that £137 billion funds lavish lifestyles, it funds criminality, it funds firearms, drugs, exploitation. And it also causes enormous amounts of harm to individuals who, as a result of fraud and economic crime, suffer life-changing impacts. It also is an example of where crime in the last 20, 30 years has changed, and particularly in the last 10 years, where it has moved from the public space into the private space, and where the digital explosion of data, of devices, of online communication has really had an impact, probably more than we ever anticipated. So it would have been interesting 10 years ago if we really had anticipated the harm, the trajectory, and the impact that we're now facing. And yet we struggle. We really struggle collectively across policing, more broadly across the ecosystem, to understand and to develop a system that's going to work for us moving forward. This webinar is the start of some work, and it's work that is about developing our thinking into probably quite radical approaches going forward. And not just thinking about the radical approaches, but understanding how we can take forward those radical approaches in a way that is innovative, that is tangible, and most importantly, will make a real difference to citizens of the United Kingdom. In the first instance, I'd like to introduce Ian. And what I'm going to ask, Richard. And Richard, just in a few short moments, I'm going to go to each of the panelists, and I'm going to ask you to give me the context of why you think this is important, from where you have come on your journey, and you all have expertise in this space, what it is you think we need to be doing, how we can take it forward positively, what can we do, and just to give us your expert view on where we currently are in 2022. And really, in the first instance, Richard, is to you, and also just obviously from the research and the key position of resources, systems and skills. Can we have your thoughts around what the future of economic crime policing should look like?
Thank you very much, Karen, and good afternoon to everybody. I'm among the panelists, very much the newcomer to this topic, but the aspect that got me and the organisation I work for, the Social Market Foundation, interested in economic crime was our broader interest, our long-standing interest as a think tank in public services and what role public services play in creating a prosperous and peaceable and just society. And I don't think at any time you can ignore crime as one of the key problems facing any society, and the importance of policing and the criminal justice system as part of a functioning and happy society. And then within that, it was hard not to notice the huge and glaring issue of economic crime and the costs, both financial and personal, and I guess societal, that were being caused by it. So that was sort of the motivation for our interest. And then we perhaps rather presumptuously decided to dive into the debate around how you might design a better approach to tackling economic crime in the UK, and so published a short piece a couple of months ago now, sort of outlining some ideas about how we might think about changing the current structures that face and deal with economic crime, with the intention of throwing out some ideas that would help improve the situation. And one of the key aspects to us was quite clearly the resourcing, and within that context, sort of the skills or the lack of skill sets among law enforcement to deal with complex economic crime. So I thought in the remaining few minutes I've got left, I'd throw out some numbers, which we have some of them in our piece that we published a couple of months ago, which sort of give us a good sense of how under-resourced the fight against economic crime is in the policing space. So for example, as of the end of March 2021, the Home Office data suggests there are about 135,000 police officers in England and Wales, supported by just over 75,000 other police staff. So just north of 200,000 people working in and around policing across England and Wales. And yet the Home Office data also shows that just over 1,700 of those actually work on economic crime, and that's less than 1% of that total number of people working in policing in England and Wales. And given fraud is sort of about 4 in 10 of the crimes people report being victims of in the crime survey in England and Wales, that struck us as quite a mismatch. And then, if you delve into the numbers a bit more, we uncovered, for example, that for every police officer or civilian worker in the police, there are about 2,500 frauds that are committed. If you use the crime survey England and Wales data, and if you use the police recorded data, you're looking at about 1,000 fraud offences for every 2.1 police officers or other staff that work on it. And many watching this will also know that the Barber review that came out recently estimated that the clear-up rate for frauds is about 0.1%. So I think those numbers give you a sense of how there's a mismatch between the size of the scale of the crime that's going on and where police resources are at. And by comparison, if you strip out fraud and cybercrime from the crime numbers, and you look at the ratio of police officers to the number of crimes that aren't fraud and cyber, if you use the Crime Survey England and Wales numbers, you're looking at 42 crimes per police officer. This is using 2021 data. And if you're using the police recorded crime numbers, you're looking at about 36 crimes per police officer. And as we know, quite infamously, there's a 7% sort of clear up rate, if you like. 7% of crimes end up in a charge or a summons at the moment. So again, hopefully that sort of gives a bit of perspective about quite how much fraud and economic crime more generally sort of swamps the resourcing based on it. I'll just finish by saying, so in our paper, we argue for something which we call a systems approach, which is basically to, we argue that basically any new approach needs to understand that I think while policing is very important, it's not the only element that needs to be changed in order to deliver a much more effective than we currently have effort against economic crime, and that the new approach should recognise all the interconnectedness between a whole range of different domains, and we outline about 10 in our piece, ranging from the policing through the criminal justice process to the private sector to leadership across government and the public sector. But I'll leave it there, and I'll be happy to talk more about anything the SMS said in our in the Q&A. So,
thank you, Richard. I think some really stark figures that speak for themselves, and I know that it seems to be all the lines and all the points in the graph are going in the wrong way, and this divergence. And I would just like to take that forward to yourself, Sue, in terms of what you think needs to happen. I know you have some really key thoughts around the skill bit and where we need to go with that. So I'll just hand over to you for your comments.
Thanks so much, Karen. I'm really excited to be having this discussion with such a great group of people, and it's really timely. I think we've just seen this morning that the government have responded to the Treasury Select Committee's inquiry on economic crime, saying that the multi-agency approach to economic crime is working, and that there's enough money that has been put in so far to resolve the problem, and so no new commitment really to look at that. So at Spotlight, we monitor primarily how the UK's anti-corruption laws are being enforced. And I've been looking at how the UK enforces anti-corruption for about 20 years. And back in 2006, I remember going around all the different police agencies saying, who's going to investigate, overseas corruption? And no one would do it. In fact, someone from the Met said, I think we should do a public-private partnership and have co-sponsored police cars. And it was only actually when the aid agency said, okay, we're putting money on the table. Here's ring-fenced money to actually investigate and prosecute bribery. Everyone jumped on board and everyone wanted to do it. And some great things came out of that. We had a brilliant unit at the Met that was, went after 3 different Nigerian governors, convicted one of them, still been going through the courts with his assets, but, and the overseas anti-corruption unit at the city, had like really quite significant, prosecutions, 12 or so prosecutions for bribery of individuals and middle-sized companies. And then the SFO, who wasn't funded, jumped on board too, because all the agencies were like, yeah, no, we want to be doing this. So I guess my point is, to back up what Richard said, resourcing has got to be critical in this, because where there are resources, that's where priorities go. So I think the key question is, how do we get there? I mean, we think that you just have to double the budgets of the core agencies involved in this fight. And I think we'll probably come on to structures a bit later, because I think, I think there's some really important things to discuss on that. Back in 2019, Lynn Owens very bravely, she's the only kind of, senior person in law enforcement, I think, to really try and put a figure on it, said it was 2.9 billion the law enforcement needed over 3 years to fight serious and organized crime. And we know economic crime is a subset of that, but they do go together, because it's similar skills that you need to track down, the money, and, they're separate questions, strategic question about how much we separate those two, which would be great to discuss. But, that's, for the NCA alone, she suggested a doubling of the budget. That didn't happen. our research has shown that actually the core budget of the NCA declined over the last 5 years by 4%. And there's some really serious issues about, is the NCA actually the UK's FBI? Are we serious about that or not? How do we, what role would it play then, as the UK's FBI in relation to other police agencies, is a separate question we can come on to. But, if we're serious about that, what should the NCA look like? And I think that's a really, I hope we can have a really important discussion about that. The other thing that we suggested in our report that came out in January was that there should be reinvestment of the money that law enforcement brings in. Actually, we went much broader than we went for regulatory fines as well, in money laundering. And if you took that all together, over the last 5 years, it's been about 3.9 billion has been brought in by law enforcement. A lot of that actually through DPAs at the SFO. But, that's money that if it was reinvested in technology and key data analytics across law enforcement, this could actually really genuinely lead to a step change. And I think it's that language step change we have to ask ourselves. The National Economic Crime Centre was set up back in, was it 2019? And, it was meant to lead to a real step change. That was the language that we used. And I think when, everyone says it's great, it's helped a bit with coordination, but has it actually led to a step change? What is it we need to get to that step change? How do we get the ambition? We did a little look at some of the figures, and if you reinvested just a quarter of what the SFO had brought in fines, it would have had around another 270 investigators. So we think you need to relook at ARIS and really see that this money that law enforcement is bringing in could actually be a real investment back in enforcement, because as Lord Agnew, I think, really powerfully put it, this is kind of the one area where with public investment that you will see really big returns, whether it's in prevention of crime or, more recovery of assets. How you spend it is a different issue that, maybe we'll come on to in future questions, but those are my two big pitches on resourcing.
So thank you, and that was a really broad spectrum of thoughts, which I hope we will get into in debate. I think just you really raised the issues around the NCA role, and the NCA will be involved in this. They're not on the panel today, but they will be involved in the process, because NCA is a very strong partner in terms of policing. And I think also, what's the role? But this issue around ARIS, POCA, money, how do we get there? And I think Mick will probably speak a little bit about that. That was his forte some time ago. But I'm going to come to you, Ian, first, because Ian, you very recently have been the person who has been dealing with the front door, the victims, the reports. And I'll be really interested just to get your view on your thoughts. And I'm sure you've had time to reflect in the few weeks since retirement. So I'll hand over to you for your comments.
Karen, thank you very much. And as you say, I've recently retired. I was for the last 11 years of my service in the City of London Police, which, as I think most people on the webinar know, is the National Lead Police Force Fraud. The last 6 as the Commissioner. And Karen, I'm grateful you thanked us all for giving up our valuable time. For me, that translates into not finishing the box sets that I've been watching in my retirement. So I'm looking forward to Breaking Bad finishing later this afternoon. Look, what I thought in my introductory bit was to say, here are what I think are 3 challenges, and I'm talking from the police perspective, although they clearly have a resonance beyond into the wider system. And then some thoughts on where I think there could be maybe some progress to be made. And I think the only other caveat I'd say is that if I make any comment about policing, I would not want to be seen to be critical of current serving officers and chief officers who are doing, I think, a fantastic job under some huge pressures. And I'm very proud to have been a police officer. So here's my sort of 3 challenges that I think I just throw in the mix, and they very much, I think, follow what Richard and Sue said. First of all is the volumes and the scale of what we're facing is beyond the public purse to tackle, without a doubt. I cannot see, particularly in all the forecasts on the economic state of the nation going forward over the next few years, I cannot see the sort of uplift in funding that is truly needed to come out of government or treasury. So that's sort of point number 1. Point number 2 is we all have heard some of the statistics. Richard commented on some of them about the small numbers of dedicated police resource dedicated to economic crime. But my second point is this: other crime types make for more uncomfortable headlines for both politicians and chief constables, frankly. And you've only got to look at the papers and the media in recent weeks. Child protection, safety of vulnerable people, the response times to emergencies, the trust and confidence of communities. These are things that are occupying the minds and require investment from forces that, frankly, headlines about the number of frauds and cyber just do not seem to resonate with that sort of local issue. And which links into my final point, which is policing in the United Kingdom is predominantly a local service. And from my point of view, long may that reign, really. I think I'm very cautious about moves towards anything resembling a national police force. And fraud can be local. And I think we shouldn't forget that when we're thinking about how can we tackle some of this. So here's a few things, and my figure is slightly historic because it relates to when I was in the city. From the National Fraud Intelligence Bureau, a sort of a snapshot of those crimes that were reported where a suspect was identified. It was only in about 50% of the cases that the suspect was identified as coming from a jurisdiction outside of the United Kingdom. So 50% of the identified suspects at that snapshot in time, and I suspect the figures haven't changed much, were actually United Kingdom suspects. That, to me, gives huge potential for tackling the problem in local policing. The second thing is that a lot of the criminals are local. About 4 or 5 years ago, we arrested 112 UK nationals who were working on a big boiler room scam in Spain. And apart from the ringleaders of that boiler room scam, a lot of the people that were employed in the call centre were the sort of people who, frankly, would have been breaking into cars and houses in their local area, but were tempted to come and work in the south of Spain, do their work in the call centre in the mornings, and then in the afternoons lounge on the beach. So I think there is a local dimension that is often overlooked. Thirdly, the point that Richard made quite rightly about the very low number of dedicated resource to economic crime. It's important not to forget that economic crime and fraud is perpetrated by those UK suspects. A lot are organised crime groups or individuals who are committing other crime as well. And there was lots and lots of examples where forces across the country had disrupted organised crime groups or prosecuted criminals that were committing fraud, but probably they were disrupted or prosecuted by officers that weren't necessarily dedicated to economic crime. So I think the sum of the parts is slightly greater. What needs to be done, or what's my initial thoughts, because I don't profess to have the answer to everything. First of all, and I think bluntly, the government has stalled on a lot of its reforms. Where are we with Companies House reform, which is so critical to tackling the volumes of frauds? Hence, under the bounce back loans, it seems somebody's cat could get a loan by registering a Companies House. That is really important. Where's the SARS regime? Where's the economic crime bill? I think all of this is critical to tackling the whole approach to fraud and economic crime. but I don't see any great appetite or ambition of governments to take forward the reforms that they've promised. The second thing I'd say is, when it comes to structures, which I know we're going to get into, I always balk at having debates about structures. I don't think one size does fit all. I'm not in favour of an economic crime agency or anything like that. The skills, capabilities and intelligence needed to tackle high-end money laundering or to tackle international criminality is a world apart from the skills and capability needed to tackle somebody who's defrauded somebody on eBay. I genuinely think that, and I go back to my point about a lot of fraud is quite local and can be tackled locally. I think that one size doesn't fit all applies to both enforcement, and I'm sure we'll get into that debate around the NCA versus police. It's not a straightforward debate. I find it a bit distracting from trying to get on with more important things, frankly, but it is important because it's about accountability, and that is important. But equally, intelligence, one size doesn't fit all. Technology enables us now to share intel from lots and lots of different platforms. I think acknowledging the local role in fraud and cyber is important, and I would say that coming from the background in policing. And I think I'll just sort of throw a few thoughts in that can be sort of teased out, because I do think when you do emphasise the local, you are emphasising also the role of victims and the support for victims that is needed. And I think that's really important if we want to tackle the challenge of trust and confidence in law enforcement to tackle this. So what can we do? The strategic policing requirement, in my view, needs to be more explicit around fraud. It's still quite obtuse. It talks about cyber. It needs to be far more explicit. I think there is a role for the government and for the City of London Police to influence PCCs, to raise fraud up the agenda locally. But I think if we can emphasise and focus on local victims and criminals, one of the risks of having the City of London Police as the lead force for fraud is that it has removed the visibility of that harm from local communities and from local policing. And I think there is a role for the city, and I know that they have pioneered a national economic crime victim care unit that is now being rolled out across the whole country, which is a good example of where they're starting to really show and demonstrate to local people, local communities, local policing about the importance of fraud. And the final bit, but Karen, I'm conscious of time, so I can perhaps unpick this in the question, is around, I think, going back to the public purse can't tackle all this. There needs to be a much more meaningful relationship with the private sector that is not only about funding, and I absolutely support all of Sue's comments about using asset recovery to reinvest in the system. But I also think the private sector can help around skills and capabilities. I think we should think more broadly about the relationship between the criminal and the civil in the criminal justice system and use private law and private companies to be tackling sort of like state fraud and economic crime cases. And I do think other sectors too, you know, social media companies, all of those should be made much more responsible for preventing in the first place. And it shouldn't be confined to social media. Things like, you know, how can it be that courier companies can deliver a dozen fridges to the same address, which is just a little house, terraced house, and nobody asks questions about what's happening to all these expensive bits of kit that's being delivered? You know, there's a whole range of things that if we really get into that prevention space, I can talk more, and I'll do it later, Karen, about some of the things about how we exploit some of the intelligence around victims. But I'll save that because I think I've run out of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. And again, I think a really broad base there. I think there's maybe a question for you in the Q&A. And I think, you know, you've raised the issues here, the local, the regional, the national. Is there a role for all three, Mick? I think also Ian opened up the debate and the discussion around intelligence, which is obviously one of my my soft and sweet spots, is that's where I think that's driving the business. So Mick, you had the previous portfolio of serious and organised crime. You sat very much on the national and regional with the ROC use. And I'm sure you have some comments around the broader system and the threat understanding. I'll hand over to you, Mick, just to give your perspective and some background.
Thank you, Karen. Mick Creed, and I was 10 years a Chief Constable nationally for a number of areas, including money laundering, serious organised crime and such like. And I kind of tend to be in furious agreement with lots of what being said, but not all of it. First point, government. I don't know who David Page is, but your comment, David, is 100% right. My view is the government has a responsibility, and their duty, their first and foremost duty, is to protect the citizen and protect the borders, and they decide how to do that. In this area, I've heard this talked about for 15, 20 years around the fraud economic crime debate. I could go back through 3 or 4 previous commissioners. The debate's not a new one, yet the duty of the government to protect the citizen, the state and the economy doesn't seem to hit home here. And I'll come on to thoughts at the end why. The government shown they can do that with crisis. When COVID and the pandemic hit us, they decided to invest. I think they made some disastrous mistakes. They gave money away hand over fist to criminals, but equally they did everything they could do to protect the citizen. Yet they don't do that in other areas. And I could give many examples. If they apply the public health approach to COVID, as they do to obesity in other areas which shut down McDonald's, we took the COVID approach. So my first and foremost is the duty of the state to protect the citizen. And this is where leadership comes in. And we haven't had leadership from politicians in this area. The second is, again, Ian made this point, so I won't labour it, crime and complexity. No crime exists in isolation. The majority of serious organised criminals that we see are heavily involved in fraud and money laundering. That's what they do. They don't want a pay-as-you-earn lifestyle. They want a lifestyle where they can do what they want, get the money as fast as they can. And I won't bother going through all the crime types. And this actually includes terrorism as well in many cases. So let's not pretend it exists in isolation, which is why I think debates about structures and creating national bodies is it's a distraction. We're looking at something which is not a silo event. We're looking at something which is part of criminal activity, which goes right the way from the neighbourhood to the international. I might say as well, I was the architect, constructor and champion from the regional units for the last 20 years. And again, I have a nervousness that we layer things very conveniently at local, regional, national. It doesn't work like that. It's about where you put specialist capabilities to deal with problems in a more efficient and effective manner. So I think this issue about crime and how it affects is important. There's another massive issue, I think, about public value. There's a huge difference between what the public value and what adds value to the public. And unfortunately, policing, the way policing is governed and run, and the way policing is localised through PCCs, means sometimes what the public value takes precedence over what adds value to the public. They are different things completely. And so I think in this area, for whatever reason, and you'll all have your own thoughts, we have had a tolerance from the government, from the banking sector, and from policing through PCCs, through leadership, through competing demands, which means this area of criminality doesn't tend to get the focus which we think it might do. And I'm guessing the audience have dialed in for that very same reason. But then what I would say is, again, Ian was saying this, you've got to look at policing in terms of this, the complexity of competing demands. Every police force in this country could quadruple the resources and more looking at child abuse, online paedophilia, historic offences. They could quadruple and put more. And the tech is such now that they could be arresting paedophiles who are sharing imagery, disgusting imagery all the time. This debate could be a different debate about that area of policing and how we deal with it. Let's not pretend that there's a huge pool of resources either. You know, the skilled people that are available to do this kind of work are few and far between. And the more you layer things, the more you create national units, the more you actually just take people away from one place to another place, and you pretend and make the mistake of thinking this is a silo event. So I think I won't bother going on to the complexity of demands, but you know, putting it bluntly, if you're having shooting on your streets in the metropolitan city, or if you're having public disorder, or if you're having huge pressure because of street burglaries and a whole range of infractions, you can't ignore them. That's what policing is there for. So I think it's a real danger that we see this as a policing issue and not an all-round issue for the state, for private sector, public sector, for the third sector, for public institutions. It's much broader than that. And I do always think the starting point, although I spent my life as a detective, The starting point is prevention. What can we do to actually stop this? And there's a huge amount can be done. Structures, I get very nervous about. Ian mentioned this. Can't we go through it again? But I just think back in recent years, the creation of the Asset Recovery Agency was a step change. That will change everything. 20 years ago, well, it didn't. Guess what? The creation of NCIS, the intelligence system, would change intelligence for policing and agencies. It didn't. The soccer was the pre-agency before the NCA. Exactly the same debate around soccer. I remember being at a briefing with the PM, and he said, "When do you think you'll beat citizen organised crime then?" As if the creation of an agency will be the answer to this kind of multi-layered complex problem. CEOP around child protection. Let's by all means create an agency, have a new title, have a new head of it, and let's have a fanfare that civil servants will think is great. It ain't going to change the problem. The problem is big. And the closing bit I want to get into is change. Okay, there's an opportunity, I think, that might stumble our way here. I've looked at this in my 40 plus years involved in policing, and I can tell you the only time for real seismic change is when an event happens that, for whatever reason, causes a whole system approach. And I could go through them. I'll mention a few. Peter Sutcliffe changed murder investigations forever. Long time ago, I know, the Ripper inquiry. You could argue similarly, Stephen Lawrence, for lots of the reasons. I won't go into all the change. Certainly the 81 riots, the 84 miners' strike, the 89 Hillsborough disaster, Ian Huntley, the murder in 2002, created the Police National Database, a different way of intelligence sharing. I can go on with 7/7, with Baby P, with Jimmy Savile around child protection, phone hacking. These are the events that, for some reason, they hit the headlines. You get a public inquiry, and you do get change. And I could tell you what change happened with all of these, big change. It's never happened in this area. So there's two cases I quoted recently. The case of Fazim Chowdhury. I've got no idea what these cases are. Fazim Chowdhury was £113 million banking fraud, and Jagmeet Channa was £72 million. To me, that's off the scale. That's a police budget for a whole force, but that's not changed anything. So where's the change going to come that's going to actually cause seismic change? It's the chaos theory of change. You need something bad to happen to make big change. Now, the only thing I do think is there's two massive events going on at the minute. COVID has completely changed with the amount of fraud and the money that's hemorrhaged from the system. And as we settle and look into COVID, we're going to realise the waste of money, of public money, but also the stuff that was given away to criminals without due diligence. And secondly, the Ukraine events. Karen, me and Ian would all tell you that we've been speaking for years about dirty money that was in the UK, dirty Russian, Chinese money, and nothing ever happened, even though we knew where it was. Suddenly, with the Ukraine event, something happens, and those tens of millions and billions are being seized. Now, whether we'll ever get them is immaterial. The fact is there's recognition. So I think we need to articulate to the politicians at the start of this, the scale of this problem in critical sense, because they'll never get it on a volume sense. They will never, ever get it, because that's part and parcel of the complexity. Thanks, Carol.
Okay, thank you, Mick. And really conscious of time, but I think, again, that moves into, we've had no watershed event, we've had no big change event. Policing is not working in a silo. There are many, many competing issues, which I think Ian touched on as well. Mick, I know you have to drop off, and I know you have to drop off sort of very soon. So I'm going to come to you slightly out of order. And what I would like to know, just in probably 1 or 2 minutes here, is you talk about threat assessment, but you also talked about your view and restructuring. Do you want to have a comment around where does that sit? What can we do for the future? What should we be doing for the future?
What we don't need, Karen, is more and more threat assessments. I look out the window now, and I don't need a detailed threat assessment to know whether to wear a coat or an umbrella or wear boots. We don't need more of that. We can discuss this problem when we know it's there. So what we need to do is articulate it very, very clearly. I think the structures part of it, as I say, for me, it's not about structures. It's about having that whole system now, and that's a much used hackneyed phrase. But ultimately, paedophilia, child protection, domestic violence in my youth were not things ever thought of. DNA was never thought of. It wasn't even around at all. Now every officer thinks it straight away. When they go to addresses, when they deal with victims, when they go and do searches, they think immediately. Okay? We don't think about assets. We don't think about fraud. We don't think, why has that guy got that 2-year-old BMW on his front drive and a 154-inch TV in his living room when I know he's not got any money? We don't think that way. So it's about getting it through to the psyche and thinking of everyone. That financial, I mean, I don't even like the phrase economic crime, personally, but the people who are making money out of crime should be on everyone's radar, and we should be chasing what they're doing. So I think it's, for me, Karen, let's not please get lost in debates about structures and threat assessments. Let's look at how we actually make this part of the DNA of law enforcement in the wider sense, not just policing.
Thank you, Mick. And I think that's a really important point about making it the DNA and the part of thinking. It becomes our second, it's our natural business as usual thinking. And in terms of that, Ian, you know, we're not starting at ground zero. So there are models there. We have levels of connectivity. We already connect to the National Economic Crime Centre. And I know that in recent years, for example, there's been greater connectivity around the issues of intellectual property crime, which is just another shade of economic crime that benefits criminals and organised criminal networks. Do you want to make comment or just your learning from the last few years on that, and what comments you would have around that, and I suppose a little bit around the systemic prevention, which is intelligence led?
Yeah, thanks, Karen. So I think prevention has to be the key focus if we're to tackle the sort of the volumes. And you know, the evidence for that is evident to all of us. You know, it's, if you look at things like the autumn, you know, car crime, it was lots and lots of initiatives by the manufacturers to make cars harder to steal, to that enabled that crime type to fall. Although I think technology is almost sort of, they've got ahead of themselves, and now it seems that some of the keyless stuff is easier to steal. But I think the whole point is you get into that virtuous prevention cycle. Now, I think there is still lots of opportunity around that. The thing about the shift of fraud online means that more and more fraud is perpetrated by platforms that are operated by companies and organizations. And they are slowly being drawn into that sort of accountability and responsibility piece. It started, in my view, I mean, if you remember, some of us are old enough to remember when it was said that the internet was unpoliceable. That was a sort of a maxim. It was free for all. And we know that's not true. But the companies, the social media companies, people running the platforms, I think have moved slowly. They've started, in my view, around the terrorism threat, and they started to police and to monitor you know, extremist material, etc. They've been pushed, in my view, and they're sort of moving in that space around things like protection of young people. And I think there is growing interest in protecting young people rather than just children, excuse me, from trolling and the sort of really harmful content in social media and texting and whatever. But I think in this space, there's still more to be done. And I think it requires law enforcement sometimes to be the enabler to drive that. So, excuse me, if you took dating websites, for example, the companies have done a lot of work recently to protect the individual from harm when they get to the meeting. So, you know, they don't share phone numbers straight away, etc., etc. But have they really done enough to look at behavioural patterns that fraudsters are using to start to lure in victims? Because we know that that's grooming in the broadest sense. I think you would apply that across child exploitation and things like that. I do apologise, I've got a bit of a cough, but to your broader point, Karen, I think what that does lead to is we haven't fully exploited the opportunities of partnership with the private sector. That's my view.
Yeah.
And I think some of that is there's been historic perceptions of that. Certainly when I started in the city, private sector was seen as the money pot. We're short of money. You've got loads of money. Give us the money. Doesn't work like that. We all know that. I think skills and capabilities that they have that they can share is really a great opportunity. Secondment, stuff like that doesn't need to cost them necessarily a cash prize. And then there's the bit that you talked about, Karen, which is the PIPCU, for those on the call, Police Intellectual Property Crime Unit, funded by the Intellectual Property Office, tackling counterfeiting and intellectual property crime. Been a unit housed in the city for about 10 years now, really successful. Last year, expanded into a unit that is based up in Manchester, in the Northwest Regional Crime Unit. Now, the idea of that is to see if we can test that model of regional capability coordinated by the centre, funded by the private sector, that enables scale and coverage, but retaining that element of locality. In my view, it's got really, really promising sort of indications. Even despite the pandemic, the team of 6 have done something like 80 warrants tackling counterfeit crime and fraud up there. And I think that's really important, because to finish my comment, in the debate about structure, we're not going to get into that, but in the debate about national versus local, one of the things I think that people confuse or conflate or use coterminous, whatever you want to say, is 2 words, one coordination and one control. And I think that's the mischief. I am not in favour of a national agency for a lot of the reasons we've articulated, because it's linked to so many other crime types. And I know James in the chat had asked that question. But I am in favour of national coordination, absolutely. Coordination is not control. And I think if you don't go for the control piece, you go away from the debates about accountability, the links with elsewhere. Coordination is really, really important in this space. That's slightly rambling. I apologize. I got a coughing fit halfway through, but I think it's private sector. Absolutely. We've got to push for that. It doesn't have to be a money transaction. It's about skills, capabilities, and it can be about enhancing capability. And coordination, yes. Control, no.
Thank you, Ian. And I think one thing I'd just like to add around the PIPCU success, and it is a promising model, is that it shows what good integration between local services, national services, and there is a model that actually we could grow into that and we have a public-private aspect, and there could even be that financial sector and an NCA extension. So there's many, many ways in which that model can be grown. And I think the key thing was that we were going into a high risk area with Greater Manchester Police, in that it was very highly populated with organised criminal networks that were causing a massive amount of local and regional harm. So I think that is a promising model. And I'm going to come back to you, if we have time, around your views on why the NCSC has been successful, not been successful. I know you some personal experience in that. But I would like to go to Sue first, and Richard, around the same questions. And I think the thing is, where do you see the private sector? Where do you see integration? Can it genuinely be achieved? So there's a number of comments in the questions and answers talking about, we don't have a capacity, we don't have a will. First of all, Sue, do you think there is capacity? Do you think, is there a will? And where do we go with the private sector in this, say, in the next 3 years?
Yeah, could I say just, there's a good question from Helena actually in the chat about, what about this 400 million that the government has announced that they're going to be spending between now and 2025. And I just wanted to clarify that is actually a large part of that is coming from the economic crime levy, which can only be spent on money laundering. There is an agreement that none of that will be spent on fraud. So that isn't very hopeful in terms of, how we've increased money for fraud in enforcement. And then the second thing I think I want to say is really about structures, because while I completely agree with, I think it was Mick who said, there does seem to be that, the government's response to any crisis is to create a new structure. And so, we've got the new combating kleptocracy cell in the NCA, even though there was already an international corruption unit, we've got a new public sector fraud authority. Maybe that's a good thing. I don't know, but it does seem that the response is, it's no wonder we have so many agencies in this field. If for every crisis you create a new agency. But I do think the point about the national agency, I don't think the structure thing is completely a red herring or should be avoided, actually, because we have some national level agencies. And the question is, how are they going to fit with policing? So maybe that, having a national police force is a red herring or a distraction, but working out how the NCA and the police are going to work together, I think is really crucial, because with the NCA is not going away, what do we want the NCA's role to be? And we think that, you have to, two things. One of them is the NCA's staff, their salaries are pegged to 90% of what the police get. So it's hardly surprising that they have kind of retention issues. Do we want to kind of flow through between the NCA and police forces? Personally, I think you do, because you want people in the NCA who do have been detectives, know how to, put together really, complex, search warrants and all those skills. So I think, but we're not, is that happening at the moment? It doesn't seem it is. So I think that relationship between the NCA and policing, we do need to bottom that out, actually, and we need to work out what do we want from the NCA. And that kind of relates to another thing is, there's a lot of talk, both Ian and Mick are talking about, online child sexual exploitation. Is that economic crime? When is it economic crime? We come to these kind of boundaries, like what are we talking about? Because in a way it does matter, because we can't set our targets and our metrics if we don't, know what we're talking about. And certainly in our research, we found, the NCA wouldn't give us a breakdown of what they spent on economic crime, because they said it's all economic crime. But I question that. I question whether actually, busting drugs gangs, maybe going off their money is, tackling economic crime, but is actually busting the gang itself economic crime. So I think there's some definitional issues in there. And then just finally, because your question was about the private sector, I think, we also have to be careful, like with foreign bribery, when the people at the Met said, we should do a private public partnership, and, it was actually, frankly, rubbish, because these companies who pay bribes and benefit from it. So I think we also have to just make sure that we aren't, it seems to me sometimes that's the thing we reach for, whereas actually there are some types of crime which, corporates may themselves commit, and actually, there needs to be some deterrence as well through prosecution, we would say. So it can't all be through dialogue, I guess is what I'm trying to say, that you have to have the deterrence of the criminal law to actually get prevention.
Okay, and before I come to you, Richard, there's a couple of questions which I do want to try and quickly cover. And if the panelists would have a look at these questions, we're really on time. So I think a couple of things, and I did answer to one saying that the private sector really only interested in profit, and it's very hard to work with them. I think having come from the private sector, there's a number of things. The legislative gateways do not provide sufficient comfort for the free and agile sharing of data. And I think there is an appetite to share data more appropriately in a legitimate and proportionate way. So that is something around the broader system reform, which and I know that Rusi have been involved in that, around addressing that. I think a couple of issues somebody else has raised. We have raised issues of overseas corruption, bribery, fraud, money laundering. Could go on forever. And where does that start? Where does it finish? I think it raises a really good point that perhaps what we do and we look at in policing, if it's the structure of policing and law enforcement, we have to start and choose a starting point. And that's where discussion. So definitely fraud is very under-resourced. Richard, you raised that. Money laundering is not particularly well resourced. Banking is overrun around compliance. So there are certain, I would say, key priority places where we could start. And then with a longer term view, I think some of the good stuff around, a longer term strategy and fraud would help us perhaps address some of those issues. In terms of the private sector, Richard, I'm really keen to pull out, and we are really stuck for time, but I didn't want to miss some of those questions. Where do you think where's the so what? So where can we go? What should we be doing with the private sector? Can they be filling some of those resource skills gaps going forward? What are your thoughts?
Yes, so in short, the SMS view is yes. I think that it sounds like there's quite a lot of consensus around, for example, the tech companies, the platforms, the financial services sector, the legal profession, accountants and so on, bearing more responsibility for sort of prevention, sort of gumming up potentially some of the avenues that fraudsters utilize as part of their activity. It sounds to me that there's quite a powerful consensus brewing to sort of demonstrate to government that there are a range of actions around those elements of the private sector that could be improved. I think our view more brought on, for example, leveraging in private sector skills to support policing of economic crime. I think again, our systems approach calls for more of that, and we propose the idea of whether some sort of framework can be created which would essentially deputize law firms or specific lawyers or accountancy firms and accountants to essentially work as arms of the police under a sort of a license or a deputization type system to augment what, as we were saying at the beginning, is currently, and I totally take all the points on board about how fraudsters are sometimes caught through sort of other crimes that they're committing rather than the fraud itself. But still, what is generally seems to us quite a very small policing resource directed towards economic crime. So yeah, we'd love to see government, we'd love to see RUSI, we'd love to see organisations think about what mechanisms could be created to sort of leverage in that private sector capacity and capability.
Okay, thank you, Richard. I think we have I want to cover in a minute, Ian, so you're under pressure here. I think there was one question there about the Crime Prevention Agency or a National Crime Prevention Agency. It came out of the new mode of policing review done recently. Just, I suppose, in about a minute, can I have your thoughts on it? A nice one to finish.
Yeah, an interesting proposal, which you might be surprised to know I'm not necessarily against. I think it's about galvanizing at the proper and appropriate national level, the sort of respective thinking of all agencies involved in this crime type to work through how do you prevent. And that's about looking at process and system, because criminals exploit a vulnerability. If you can find that vulnerability and plug it, you prevent the crime. And if there is work and investment which involves academia and law enforcement, the private sector in one agency, I'm in favour of that. Where I think the mischief will be is what powers it has, and that's an interesting debate, because the report you referred to mentioned quite stark powers. That's the debating point.
Okay, so I think we are right down to probably trying to pull all of these ideas together, and I'm glad this is being recorded, and I'm glad that I have the suggestions from the questions and answer panel. We've done our best to try and cover as much of that as possible, and there certainly are themes through that. But in terms of concluding, I think it's worth just trying to summarize very, very quickly, and that is a challenge. But I think what I'm hearing from the panelists today is we can't walk away. There is definitely a funding, resource and skills challenge that we have to meet. Some of that might be met by funding from the private sector, but also by skills and this greater integration. while we talk about policing and the work that we're about to embark on as policing, it's absolutely a broad ecosystem approach. I think also what I'm hearing, and it's a very interesting, what you talk about in the crime prevention, that National Crime Prevention Agency, the systemic, the intelligence-led crime prevention, it's definitely the cheapest, most effective way to go. But what powers would they have and how would that roll out? And I think one thing for me around something like that is it has to be linked into the everyday business. It can't sit on its own. It can't be a white elephant to the side of society. And I think the other stuff, we're going back to where we started, is all the figures seem to be diverging in the wrong direction. And there doesn't seem to be any leveling out. So what that all indicates, I think, to wrap up, is there is a crisis. We haven't got a watershed. We may never get a watershed. But I think the thing here is that we have seen, particularly with the Ukrainian crisis, we're as close to testing where we could go. And I think, in fairness to all of the parties involved, to the people that we're speaking to in government and the Home Office, there is an appetite to try and turn this tanker around. So let's hope we'll take the views of the audience, we'll take the questions, and we're taking this from the panel. And this is the start of developing a paper. If you have suggestions, if you have ideas, please do come back to us with those. So thank you for your time. Sorry for running over, and I bid you all good afternoon. Thank you.